Picture this. It's September 1939. German tanks are rolling across the Polish border, and the world is about to be plunged into the deadliest conflict in human history. Ask most historians what caused World War II, and they'll point to the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler's ambitions, or the failure of appeasement. And they're not wrong, but they're not telling you the whole story either. Because buried beneath the standard narrative of dictators and diplomacy lies something far more disturbing. A web of financial connections that stretches from Wall Street to Berlin. American corporations that helped build Hitler's war machine. Bankers who financed the Third Reich while their own governments prepared to fight it. And a series of economic decisions that didn't just fail to prevent the war, they made it inevitable. What if I told you that the road to World War II was paved not just with good intentions, but with American dollars? That the same industrial titans who claimed to stand for democracy were quietly bankrolling fascism? That the economic architecture designed to prevent another war actually guaranteed one? This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented history that's been hiding in plain sight for decades. So let's pull back the curtain and examine what really caused the Second World War. Because once you see the financial fingerprints left all over this catastrophe, you'll never look at history quite the same way again. The poison pill, Versailles and the economic time bomb. We need to go back to 1919, to the Palace of Versailles, where the victors of World War I gathered to decide Germany's fate. On the surface, the Treaty of Versailles looks like what it claims to be, a peace settlement. But in reality, it was an economic execution. The treaty stripped Germany of 13% of its territory. Gone were Alsace-Lorraine, handed back to France. The Saar Basin, with its rich coal deposits, placed under League of Nations control for 15 years, its resources flowing to France as reparations. West Prussia, carved away to give Poland access to the sea. And this wasn't just about land. These territories represented a quarter of Germany's coal production and 3/4 of its iron ore. But the real dagger was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. With the stroke of a pen, Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for starting the war. And that meant paying for it. All of it. Now here's where things get interesting. When German representatives signed the treaty in June 1919, they didn't actually know how much they'd owe. The Allies made them sign what amounted to a blank check. It wasn't until 1921 that the Reparations Commission finally set the figure. 132 billion gold marks. That's roughly $33 billion in 1920s money, or about $473 billion today. To put that in perspective, this was a sum so astronomically large that the British economist John Maynard Keynes, who attended the Paris Peace Conference, warned it would be impossible to collect without destroying the German economy entirely. He wrote that the treaty would lead to economic chaos and, ultimately, another war. Most leaders ignored him. Germany couldn't pay. It was mathematically impossible. The country had lost its most productive industrial regions, its merchant marine fleet had been seized, and its economy was shattered. When German officials tried to explain this, they were told to figure it out, start printing money, raise taxes, sell state assets. The Allies didn't care how it got done, as long as the money kept flowing. So Germany tried. The Weimar government printed money to pay striking workers and meet reparations. And then they printed more and more. By 1923, the German mark had become worthless. At the peak of hyperinflation, a single US dollar was worth 4.2 trillion marks. People needed wheelbarrows full of cash to buy a loaf of bread. Life savings evaporated overnight. The middle class was wiped out. Think about what this does to a society. Millions of Germans who'd done everything right, worked hard, saved their money, followed the rules. watched as their entire lives dissolved into worthless paper. Who do you think they blamed? The Democratic government that signed the treaty? The November criminals who'd supposedly stabbed Germany in the back? And increasingly, the bankers and Jewish financiers who became convenient scapegoats. But here's what most history books gloss over. This economic devastation wasn't an unfortunate accident. It was baked into the treaty from day one. The French premier, Georges Clemenceau, knew Germany probably couldn't pay the reparations. He didn't care. The point was to keep Germany weak, to prevent it from ever threatening France again. What he didn't anticipate was that economic humiliation creates its own kind of threat. The American Rescue Mission, or was it, entered the United States. By 1923, even American policymakers could see that Europe was spiraling toward catastrophe. Germany was in hyperinflation. France had occupied the Ruhr industrial region to seize coal as payment, and the whole continent seemed ready to explode. Plus, there was a practical problem. America had loaned billions to Britain and France during World War I, and those countries were depending on German reparations to pay the Americans back. If Germany collapsed, the whole system collapsed. So in 1924, the United States assembled a committee led by Charles Dawes, a Chicago banker and future vice president, to solve the German reparations crisis. What emerged was the Dawes Plan. On paper, it looked reasonable enough. Reduce Germany's immediate payments from the crushing London schedule to something more manageable, starting at 1 billion marks per year and gradually increasing. Reorganize the Reichsbank. End the French occupation of the Ruhr. And here's the key part. Loan Germany 800 million marks to stabilize its currency and restart its economy. Half of that loan came from American banks. J.P. Morgan floated the bonds on Wall Street, and they sold like hotcakes. American investors couldn't get enough German debt. Over the next 4 years, American banks would pump billions of dollars into Germany, most of it short-term loans at high interest rates. And it worked. Sort of. The German economy roared back to life. Factories reopened. Unemployment plummeted. New buildings went up in Berlin and Hamburg. By 1929, German industrial production had increased 50%. Germany's share of world trade was actually higher than before World War I. The Americans congratulated themselves on engineering a financial miracle. But let's pause and ask a question that should have been obvious. What exactly were they rebuilding? The Dawes Plan had no restrictions on what Germany could do with all this foreign capital, no oversight on whether loans went toward civilian or military purposes, no controls on heavy industry versus consumer goods. American money flowed into German steel mills, chemical plants, and factories, the exact industries that would become the foundation of Hitler's war machine just a few years later. In 1929, the Dawes Plan was replaced by the Young Plan, which reduced the total reparations to 112 billion marks, payable over 58 years, conveniently until 1988. Another loan of $300 million flooded in. More American investment, more industrial expansion. And then the Great Depression hit. When Wall Street crashed in 1929, those short-term loans that had been keeping Germany afloat, they got called in, all at once. German unemployment skyrocketed from 1.3 million in 1929 to over 6 million by 1932. The middle class that had just barely recovered from hyperinflation got hammered again. And into this economic chaos walked a failed Austrian painter with a gift for scapegoating and a promise to restore German greatness. Adolf Hitler didn't invent the crisis. American financial policy did. The Nazis just weaponized it. Wall Street's dirty secret, banking on the Third Reich. Now we get to the part of the story that should have ended careers and landed people in prison. Because while most Americans assume that once Hitler came to power in 1933, American businesses cut ties with Germany, the truth is exactly the opposite. Let's start with Prescott Bush. Yes, that Prescott Bush, father of one president, grandfather of another. Prescott was a partner at Brown Brothers Harriman, one of Wall Street's most prestigious investment banks. Through Brown Brothers Harriman, he was a director of Union Banking Corporation, which handled all banking operations outside Germany for Fritz Thyssen. Who's Fritz Thyssen? Only one of Germany's biggest steel and coal magnates, and the man who literally wrote a book called I Paid Hitler. Thyssen had been funding the Nazi Party since the early 1920s, providing the money Hitler needed to build the brown-shirted SA stormtroopers, establish party offices, and spread his message. When Hitler seized power in 1933, Thyssen's support paid off. His steel empire became central to German rearmament. And Prescott Bush's bank? Union Banking Corporation was handling Thyssen's American assets the entire time. The U.S. government knew about it too. In October 1942, 8 months after America entered World War II, the U.S. government seized Union Banking Corporation's assets under the Trading with the Enemy Act. They found that UBC had been operating as a front company for the Thyssen family, moving Nazi money around the world. But here's the thing. No one went to jail. No trials. No prosecutions. After the war, the assets were quietly returned to the American shareholders. Some sources suggest Bush sold his shares for $1.5 million, a fortune in 1940s money. The Bush family fortune that would later fund political dynasties had roots in Nazi Germany. And Prescott Bush wasn't alone, far from it. Standard Oil, controlled by the Rockefeller family, had extensive business ties with IG Farben, the massive German chemical conglomerate. In 1927, Standard Oil and IG Farben literally formed a joint company called Standard IG Farben. They traded patents. Standard gave the Germans technology for coal hydrogenation to make synthetic fuel, while IG Farben gave Standard the secrets to manufacturing synthetic rubber. Why does this matter? Because when Germany prepared to invade Poland in 1939, one of its biggest vulnerabilities was fuel. Germany didn't have significant oil reserves. Without synthetic fuel technology, the Wehrmacht's tanks would have run dry before they crossed the Polish border. Standard Oil gave them the solution. But it gets darker. IG Farben didn't just make fuel. They made Zyklon B, the poison gas used in the death camps. They operated a massive industrial complex at Auschwitz using slave labor. And IG Farben's American connections ran deep. When the war ended and IG Farben executives were put on trial at Nuremberg, the prosecution found extensive documentation of their partnership with Standard Oil, DuPont, and other American chemical companies. Then there's IBM. The company's German subsidiary, Dahomag, supplied the punch card machines that made the Holocaust possible on an industrial scale. These machines helped the Nazis conduct censuses to identify Jews, track their deportation to concentration camps, and organize the death machinery. IBM's chairman, Thomas Watson, personally met with Hitler and received one of the highest medals Nazi Germany could give a foreigner, the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, for his service to the Reich. General Motors and Ford? Their German subsidiaries controlled 70% of the German auto market by 1939. When the war started, they quickly retooled to produce military trucks for the Wehrmacht. Ford's plant in Cologne used forced labor. When American bombers later destroyed these German plants, the U.S. government actually paid GM and Ford millions in compensation for the damage. Think about that for a second. American companies built the trucks that carried German troops across Poland. They made the fuel that powered the tanks rolling into France. They provided the technology that organized the Holocaust. And when American planes bombed these factories, the U.S. government paid the same companies for their losses. This wasn't just business as usual. This was American capitalism actively financing the Nazi war machine while American soldiers were dying to stop it. In 1943, a frustrated Senator Harry Truman used the word treason to describe Standard Oil's activities. Federal Judge Charles Clark said Standard Oil could be considered a national enemy for its continued work with I.G. Farben after America entered the war. But nothing happened. No executives faced criminal charges. The government chose to protect war production and keep these massive corporations intact rather than pursue justice. The appeasement trap, when weakness looked like wisdom. While American corporations were busy building Hitler's industrial base, European leaders were making their own catastrophic mistakes. But these weren't random errors. They were the logical outcome of a continent traumatized by World War I and desperate to avoid another bloodbath. Britain had lost nearly 1 million men between 1914 and 1918, an entire generation of young men buried in the mud of Flanders. The economic cost had been staggering. Britain went from being the world's largest creditor nation before the war to a debtor nation after. The psychological trauma ran even deeper. By the 1930s, British politicians would do almost anything to avoid repeating that nightmare. Enter Neville Chamberlain, who became Prime Minister in 1937. Chamberlain genuinely believed that war could be avoided through negotiation and compromise. He looked at Hitler and saw a reasonable man with legitimate grievances about the Treaty of Versailles. The Germans in Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland did have a right to self-determination, Chamberlain thought. If Britain could just be reasonable, if they could just meet Hitler halfway, surely peace could be preserved. So in September 1938, when Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, Chamberlain flew to Munich to negotiate. No representatives from Czechoslovakia were invited to this meeting, where their country's fate would be decided. Just Chamberlain, French Premier Édouard Daladier, Hitler, and Mussolini. In exchange for Hitler promising that this was his last territorial demand, they handed him the Sudetenland. Chamberlain returned to London, waving a piece of paper Hitler had signed, declaring it meant peace for our time. Crowds cheered. The immediate threat of war had been averted. Winston Churchill, then out of power but watching closely, called the Munich Agreement a total and unmitigated defeat that had deeply compromised and perhaps fatally endangered the safety and even the independence of Great Britain and France. Churchill was right. 6 months later, in March 1939, Hitler broke his promise and seized the rest of Czechoslovakia. The Munich Agreement was worthless. The policy of appeasement had failed spectacularly, and by giving Hitler the Sudetenland, which contained Czechoslovakia's border fortifications and most of its military industries, Britain and France had actually made Germany stronger and more dangerous. But here's what's rarely discussed. Appeasement wasn't just about avoiding war. It was about protecting business interests. Many British and French politicians had financial ties to German industry. They saw Hitler as a useful bulwark against communism. Better the Nazis than the Bolsheviks, they thought. Some British aristocrats and businessmen openly admired Hitler's efficiency and his hardline stance against labor unions. The governor of the Bank of England, Montague Norman, was particularly cozy with the Nazis. In 1934, Norman's bank transferred millions of pounds to Hitler's government. In 1939, even as war became inevitable, The Bank of England helped Nazi Germany sell gold bars stolen from occupied Czechoslovakia. Norman was personal friends with Hjalmar Schacht, Hitler's Reichsbank president and financial architect. They moved in the same elite circles. War was bad for business, and business wanted to keep the money flowing. So appeasement wasn't just naive optimism. It was a calculated gamble by elites who thought they could manage Hitler, use him for their own purposes, and avoid the enormous costs of another war. They were catastrophically wrong. But by the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. The perfect storm, how everything converged. By 1939, all the pieces were in place for catastrophe. The Treaty of Versailles had created a humiliated, economically devastated Germany. American loans had rebuilt German industry with no oversight on how that capacity would be used. Wall Street banks and corporations had directly financed and equipped the Nazi regime. British and French appeasement had shown Hitler that the Western democracies were too weak or too conflicted to stop him. And the Great Depression had created millions of desperate, angry Germans ready to follow anyone who promised to restore their pride and prosperity. Adolf Hitler didn't create any of these conditions. He exploited them brilliantly, but he didn't create them. The origins of World War II lie not in Hitler's twisted ideology, though that certainly mattered, but in the web of economic and political decisions made by supposedly rational actors in capitals from Washington to London to Paris. Think about the cruel irony. The Treaty of Versailles was supposed to make another war impossible by keeping Germany weak. Instead, it created the economic chaos that brought Hitler to power. The Dawes and Young plans were supposed to stabilize Europe by rebuilding Germany's economy. Instead, they rebuilt Germany's industrial capacity to wage war. American corporations were supposed to spread democratic capitalism. Instead, they armed fascism. Appeasement was supposed to prevent war through negotiation. Instead, it convinced Hitler that the democracies were too cowardly to fight. Every step seemed logical at the time. Every decision had its justifications. But taken together, they created the conditions for the deadliest conflict in human history. And here's the part that should keep us up at night. The people who made these decisions weren't monsters. They weren't evil geniuses. They were ordinary politicians, bankers, and businessmen doing what they thought was in their own interests. Prescott Bush was just trying to make money for his bank. The executives at Standard Oil and IBM were just expanding their markets. Chamberlain genuinely thought he was preventing another slaughter. The French were just trying to keep Germany weak enough that it couldn't invade again. But their individual decisions, each rational in isolation, combined to guarantee catastrophe. That's how systems fail, not through grand conspiracies, but through thousands of small betrayals, through putting profit over principle, through kicking problems down the road, through assuming someone else will clean up the mess. What history gets wrong and why it matters. The standard historical narrative of World War II treats it as essentially inevitable once Hitler came to power. We're told that the combination of German revanchism, Italian and Japanese aggression, and Allied weakness made war unavoidable by the late 1930s. And while there's truth to that, it obscures a more uncomfortable reality. World War II was avoidable. Not easily, not without significant political courage and economic sacrifice, but avoidable nonetheless. If the Treaty of Versailles had been less punitive, Germany wouldn't have descended into hyperinflation and political extremism. If American loans in the 1920s had come with restrictions on military industry, Germany couldn't have rearmed so quickly. If corporations had refused to do business with the Nazi regime, Hitler's war machine would have sputtered and stalled. If Britain and France had called Hitler's bluff at Munich, the German generals, who were planning a coup if Hitler went to war over Czechoslovakia, might have removed him from power. But none of that happened. And it didn't happen because at every decision point, the people with power chose short-term stability over long-term security. They chose profit over principle. They chose to believe comforting lies rather than face uncomfortable truths. The lesson isn't that we need to be more suspicious of Germany specifically, or that we need to relitigate the decisions of the 1930s. The lesson is that financial power and political power are inseparable, and when the people who control the money are allowed to operate without oversight or accountability, catastrophe follows. The same Wall Street banks that financed Hitler faced no real consequences after the war. Prescott Bush became a senator. IBM kept its government contracts. Standard Oil broke up, but its successor companies became some of the largest corporations on earth. The system that enabled them to profit from fascism remained intact. And here we are today, in a world where multinational corporations are more powerful than most governments, where financial interests shape foreign policy, where profit-driven decisions create humanitarian catastrophes that we only acknowledge after the fact. The specifics have changed, but the fundamental dynamic, unchecked financial power enabling political disaster, remains the same. The true origin of World War II isn't some grand conspiracy. It's simpler and more insidious than that. It's what happens when the people who control capital are allowed to pursue profit without regard for consequence. When short-term thinking drives long-term policy. When economic interconnection becomes economic complicity. Those who forget history, we're told, are doomed to repeat it. But what about those who never learned the real history in the first place? What about those of us who are taught a sanitized version that conveniently omits the financial fingerprints all over history's greatest catastrophe? The next time someone tells you that war is inevitable, that business is just business, that what corporations do in pursuit of profit isn't really a political act, remember this story. Remember how American banks rebuilt Nazi industry. Remember how British banks laundered Nazi gold. Remember how corporations on both sides of the Atlantic put profit over principle until millions were dead. Because the machinery that enabled World War II is still running. The names have changed, the locations have shifted, but the fundamental truth remains. When we let the people who control the money write the rules, we shouldn't be surprised when those rules lead to catastrophe. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And right now, if you listen carefully, you can hear the rhythm starting to build. If you found this deep dive into what really caused World War II eye-opening, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. History isn't just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding the patterns of power that shape our world. And the more we understand those patterns, the better chance we have of not repeating the same catastrophic mistakes. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.